Hello, and welcome to tonight's calm journey through history. In this gentle telling, we will drift into the shadowed halls of Renaissance Florence and follow the life of one of Europe's most mysterious queens, Catherine de Medici. If you enjoy these quiet explorations, please remember to softly like this video, leave a thoughtful comment about what fascinates you most, and subscribe so you never miss another night of history. Now, close your eyes, let the world outside grow distant, and let us begin. In the soft stillness of a fading Florence morning, a child is born, wrapped not in joy, but in whispers of loss. Her name is Catherine de Medici, the last daughter of a dynasty that carried both the brilliance and the curses of power. Her mother, Madeline, is gone within days. Her father, Lorenzo, gone soon after. And so, before she even breathes the air of childhood, she is orphaned. The cradle is empty of parents, but heavy with expectation. For Catherine is a Medici, and that name is not simply a family, but a crown of invisible thorns. Florence, in those years, was a city painted in glory, but built on shadows. The cobbled streets carried the steps of artists and the schemes of merchants. Church bells rang over marketplaces, where silk and silver changed hands. But in whispered corners, plots brewed like storms. The Medici were bankers, yet more than bankers. They were the golden spine of Europe's wealth, the secret purse of kings, the whispered ally of popes. And because of this power, they were loved by some and hated by many. The orphan child grew, not in a home, but in echoing halls. She was raised by nuns, watched by priests, kept like a precious relic, but never truly touched with warmth. Imagine her childhood: long corridors of stone, candles burning low, Latin chants weaving through the air. Her lullabies were prayers, her toys small carved saints, her lessons silence, obedience, endurance. But Catherine learned something deeper. She learned to listen, to watch, to remember. Even as a little girl, she measured people by their eyes. She noticed who feared, who hid their intentions. She carried this gift quietly, like a hidden blade. Florence itself was her teacher. The streets told her stories, not with words, but with glances. She saw merchants bow, but curse behind their teeth. She saw priests speak of heaven, but deal in secrets. She saw the Medici name, honored in daylight, but plotted against at night. Catherine understood early that power was never safe, that wealth brought enemies, and enemies never slept. The child became a watcher, and the watcher became a thinker. But life for Catherine was never still. At only 8 years old, Florence erupted. The enemies of the Medici rose. The city turned violent. Streets filled with soldiers. Bells rang not for prayer, but for war. And the little girl, the Medici child, was taken hostage. Picture it, a small orphan girl, behind the iron bars of a convent, while outside men shout for her death. Enemies of her family wanted her gone. They called her cursed. They called her poison before she ever touched a cup. For weeks, she was trapped. The walls shook with gunfire, the air filled with smoke. But she survived. She endured. The child who should have broken did not. She would never forget. As the violence faded and the Medici clawed their way back into power, Catherine was freed. But the memory stayed carved into her soul. From then on, she carried a truth: that safety is an illusion, that love is fragile, that survival requires more than hope. It requires cunning. The years passed slowly. She grew into a solemn young girl, with dark eyes that missed nothing. Her tutors taught her Latin, mathematics, the secrets of lineage and wealth. But she also learned the hidden arts: astrology, alchemy, the reading of stars, the brewing of herbs. In Florence, these were not only curiosities, but tools. And for Catherine, they became weapons of the mind. She asked questions. She watched experiments. She memorized symbols. While other children dreamed of love, she dreamed of power. The Medici, needing allies, looked across the Alps. France, vast, noble, and in need of gold. And so, before Catherine even knew the meaning of marriage, her fate was sealed. She was promised to Henry, son of the French king, a marriage not of hearts, but of ledgers. Her dowry, her family's fortune, was her weapon, her body, her passport. The orphan of Florence would become a princess of France. The day she left Florence was both a farewell and a death. She rode through the city gates, past towers and churches, past the streets that had once imprisoned her. The bells tolled, the people stared. Some blessed her, others whispered curses. She carried them all, in silence. And thus began her journey northward, into a kingdom that did not want her, into a court that would despise her, into a future that would make her name eternal. And so, the first chapter of Catherine's story closes here. An orphan child, hardened by silence, shaped by fear, armed with the Medici name. She is ready now to walk into France, into power, and into the shadows from which she will never emerge. The road to France was long and heavy with silence. Catherine sat within her carriage, hands folded, eyes wide, watching the landscapes change, from the warm hills of Italy to the colder, sterner valleys of France. She was only 14, the girl by years, but already old in sorrow. Every sound of hoof, every wheel striking stone, echoed in her chest, as if the world itself was reminding her that she was not going home, but into exile. France was not waiting with open arms. To them, she was not a bride, but a bargain. Her dowry, her fortune, was what they desired. Not her laughter, not her face, not her heart. The French nobility whispered, "She is Italian. She is foreign. She is not one of us." And whispers, in a court of power, are more dangerous than swords. The wedding day arrived, a spectacle of grandeur. Banners unfurled, choirs filled the air with hymns. And there stood Henry, her husband-to-be, silent, distant, already claimed by another. For behind him, watching with eyes of possession, was Diane de Poitiers, his mistress, his beloved. Catherine knew instantly that though the vows were hers, his heart belonged elsewhere. And so, on the very night of her union, she was already a stranger. The court did not embrace her. They mocked her accent. They sneered at her Italian dress. They ridiculed her barren years. For though she tried, she bore no child at first. A bride without beauty, without favor, without heirs, was nothing. She was humiliated, pushed aside, forced to watch, as Diane wore the jewels she should have worn, and held the place she should have held. Even the king, Henry's father, looked past Catherine and toward the mistress. But Catherine did not collapse. She did not break. Instead, she watched, and she learned. She learned how power truly worked in France. Not in titles, not in crowns, but in influence, in whispers, in the way a glance could command obedience. She studied Diane, her grace, her charm, the way she held Henry's loyalty like a chain. And Catherine vowed, silently, that one day, she too would hold such chains. The years rolled slowly, each one carving lines of patience into her soul. At night, she walked the halls alone, her steps echoing like soft drums. She turned to the stars, consulting astrologers, seeking in the heavens the secrets denied to her on earth. She turned to alchemists, to herbalists, to whispers of poison and cure. For if love was denied to her, she would find another way to be powerful. And then the miracle she had prayed for. Children. Not one, but many. Her body, once mocked, became the vessel of France's future. And with each child born, her position strengthened. The court could no longer ignore her. The queen, who was once called barren, became the mother of princes and princesses. And though Henry still clung to Diane, Catherine held a different power now. Not his heart, but his lineage. Still, the rivalry cut deep. Every feast, every hunt, every dance, Catherine saw Diane at Henry's side. The mistress glittered with jewels, commanded the king's smile, sat on cushions of silk, while Catherine, the wife, was left in shadow. It was humiliation, but also education, for Catherine realized that power was not only won in marriage, but in survival, and she had learned to survive since childhood. France was a land of pride, a kingdom of sharp divisions. The nobles, arrogant, the clergy, unbending, the court, a nest of serpents. But Catherine was patient. She watched, she listened, she waited. She stored every insult, every slight, like arrows in a quiver. One day, she thought, when the moment comes, I will release them. And so, Catherine remained, the quiet queen, the shadow at the edge of the throne. But shadows have patience, and patience outlasts beauty. She was waiting for the wheel of fate to turn, and when it turned, it would bring blood and power. Thus ends this chapter. The marriage that brought her to France, the humiliation that shaped her, the silence that armed her. Catherine de Medici, once the unwanted bride, would soon become the mother of kings. And with that motherhood, her true reign was about to begin. The court of France was a place of glittering masks, where laughter hid daggers, and every smile carried a secret. Catherine, the young Italian bride, stepped into these halls, her heart heavy, her eyes wide with both fear and calculation. She had crossed mountains, ridden through valleys, and left Florence behind, her cradle of silence, her home of shadows. Now the air smelled of incense and ambition, and she was nothing, just a girl in the middle of a storm. Diane de Poitiers towered above her in every sense, graceful, command, her beauty like a sun, casting Catherine into the shadow. The courtiers whispered, and their words were knives in soft cloth. You are Italian. You cannot speak our tongue well. You will never bear a king's favor. Catherine felt the sting, but she did not show it. Her hands remained folded, her lips closed, her eyes quiet pools of observation. For she knew that anger would be her undoing. The young queen walked behind Diane, in the grand halls, through feasts, through hunts, through the ceremonies of a kingdom that did not welcome her. She watched how the mistress spoke to Henry, how the king's laughter followed Diane like a faithful dog, and Catherine, the legal wife, was left with only her shadow and her silence. But silence was a teacher. Every glance, every gesture, every turn of the head was a lesson in power, and Catherine was learning faster than anyone realized. The courtiers thought her meek, but in her chest, a fire burned. She would not compete with beauty, or charm, or fleeting smiles. She would compete with time, with patience, with cunning. Even the king, Henry, paid more attention to Diane, and yet he could not ignore the children. Catherine bore him sons, and with each child, her presence in the palace grew stronger, like a shadow slowly stretching over the sunlit floor. The courtiers whispered still, but the whispers changed tone. From mockery to caution, Catherine had learned the most important lesson: that influence does not come from love for beauty, but from necessity, and necessity became her ally. She knew the power of her womb, the promise of heirs, the future kings of France, lay within her. Even Diane, with all her charm, could not take that away. The young bride, once humiliated, now held the seeds of authority, and she tended them quietly, like a gardener who waters the roots in darkness. At night, Catherine walked alone, through corridors lined with tapestries, her mind alive with strategy, turning like wheels in a silent clock. She whispered to herself, "Patience, always patience." She studied the court, the priests, the servants, and even the birds outside, how they nested, how they waited. Every observation was a lesson, every insult a reminder that the world was not kind, and kindness was not power. Catherine also learned the subtle arts of influence. Without being seen, without drawing attention. A nod here, a smile there, a whispered word, meant that even in shadow, she could bend the court toward her will. And while Diane ruled the king's affections, Catherine ruled the court's future, quietly, patiently, like a stream carving stone, without sound, but with inevitable force. The years passed slowly. Each feast, each hunt, each ceremony was another lesson, another opportunity to measure, to remember, to plan. And the girl, once orphaned in Florence, once mocked for her accent and foreign ways, grew into a woman, quietly formidable, her mind sharp, her patience endless, her ambition growing like ivy, up the walls of the palace, toward the sun she was denied. The courtiers continued to judge her, to whisper of her failures, but Catherine smiled rarely, spoke softly, and learned everything, because she knew that one day the tables would turn, and when they did, her power would be undeniable. She would no longer be the humiliated bride, but the queen, the mother, the shadow in the throne room that no one dared ignore. And so, the third chapter closes with Catherine, the silent observer, the patient strategist, walking the palace halls, waiting into the woman who would bend France to her will, one quiet step at a time. In the quiet hours, when the palace slept, and only shadows moved along the walls, Catherine wandered, not through halls of marble, but through chambers of thought and secret knowledge. She had survived the exile of Florence, the cold gaze of the French court, the humiliation of a husband's affection lost, and now she sought power in ways that others could not imagine. Catherine turned to the stars, gazing through small windows into the velvet night, where constellations whispered secrets, and destiny. The astrologers, those men of learning and mystery, spoke to her softly, their hands tracing lines of life across the heavens, and she listened, absorbing every movement, every hidden message. She learned the timing of events, the alignment of the planets, the secrets of when kings might fall, or when fortunes might change. But the stars were not enough. The earth held knowledge too, in roots and leaves, in powders and potions, in herbs that could heal. Catherine studied them with the curiosity of a scholar and the precision of a surgeon. She watched the alchemists, mixing liquids that glimmered like liquid gold, changing color, changing form, sometimes bubbling, sometimes still. Their work a dance between science and magic. She read books that smelled of dust, and the secret touch of hands that had vanished centuries before. Her lessons were never spoken aloud. They were whispered in candlelit corners, behind closed doors, where servants would not hear, and the walls themselves might have kept the secret. Sometimes she worked alone, her hands trembling slightly as she mixed herbs, as she traced symbols, as she wrote in secret journals, never to be seen except by herself. And slowly a pattern emerged, a knowledge of cause and effect, of life and death, of fear and obedience. For Catherine understood the power was not always in swords, or in armies, or in crowns, could also be silent, hidden, and invisible. She began to see the possibilities, the subtle ways to bend men, through fear, through persuasion, through poisons that could move silently, like whispers in the night. She created lists, courtiers, the rivals, of enemies, writing down their weaknesses, their desires, their habits, and in her mind, he played endless games of strategy, not for sport, but for survival, for dominance, for the control of a kingdom that doubted her. The French court could never have imagined that the quiet Italian bride was becoming a master of shadows. The priests warned her of sin, the nuns told her to pray, but Catherine learned that knowledge itself was neither good nor evil. It was only power, and those who wielded it carefully could survive where others fell. At night, she practiced, her handwriting in strange symbols, her potions in tiny vials, her incantations softly spoken, so no ear could hear, so no spirit could betray. Sometimes she fell asleep, with the smell of herbs and candle smoke still clinging to her hands, her mind racing with possibilities, with visions of a future where she could no longer be ignored. Catherine was no longer just a bride, no longer just a mother, no longer just a shadow in the palace. She was a student of power, a scholar of fear, a master of secrets, and the French court, with all its splendor, all its grandeur, would soon learn that knowledge was the deadliest weapon of all. The whispers of the occult, the potions, the stars, the herbs, all spoke to her as if the world itself was teaching her how to survive and how to rule. And she listened with patience, with precision, with ambition that no one could yet see. For now, she waited for the moment when the lessons would become action, and the quiet knowledge would shape the fate of France. The chambers of the palace were quiet, except for the soft cries of newborn princes and princesses, and the whispered prayers of nurses, who tended them with gentle hands. Once the orphan, once the humiliated bride, now held new power in her arms, in the children she bore. Each child a promise, each child a step toward survival, each child a key to the labyrinth of French politics. Her body, once much, was now the vessel of dynasties, and every birth shifted the balance of power in subtle yet undeniable ways. She held them close, as if their small bodies could absorb the fears and whispers that surrounded her. And yet, even in these moments of tenderness, desperation lingered like a shadow, because the court did not sleep, and neither did envy. Diane de Poix, still radiant, still commanding Henry's devotion, moved through the halls like a sun, and Catherine, like the moon, silent, cold, calculating. Every smile Diane gave Henry, every glance exchanged, was logged in Catherine's mind, not with jealousy, but with strategy. This power was never about love, but survival. The children grew, and with them, Catherine's influence expanded. The court could not deny that the mother of heirs was essential, that the survival of the kingdom depended on her womb and on her patience. Henry, who loved Diane with a fervor, could not ignore the presence of his children or the quiet authority of their mother. At night, she walked alone through halls heavy with tapestry and candlelight, thinking of plots and alliances, of enemies, and of futures yet unborn. She whispered to herself, "Every child is a shield, every child is a sword, every child is my path to power." Her lullabies, softly spoken to her children, were more than comfort. They were lessons, they were beginnings of the web she was weaving around the hearts and minds of France. Yet desperation remained, because nothing was secure. The court was alive with schemes, the nobility ever watchful, the clergy ever suspicious. And so, Catherine turned to subtlety, to whispers, to favors, to secret gifts, to quiet counsel that could bind allies without a single sword drawn. Even the smallest gesture, a touch of the hand, a look across the room, was carefully measured to strengthen her position and weaken the opposition. Her motherhood was not merely personal, it was political. Every birth, every smile, every cry was a note in the symphony of survival and power. She began to understand that love could be a tool, that tenderness could command obedience, that her presence alone could alter the course of kings and nations. And yet, the fear never left her. For every child born, there were threats, plus poisoned whispers, daring rivals, and silent enemies who wished to undo all she had endured. She slept little, dreamt often, and when she awoke, her mind turned to the strategies of the day, to the lessons of survival, to the shaping of a future where her children and she herself would rule unchallenged. The orphan, Catherine, the humiliated bride, had transformed into the mother whose womb carried the destiny of a kingdom and whose mind carried the destiny of her own power. Every step, every breath, every whisper was measured, calculated, a subtle weaving of influence that would stretch beyond her own lifetime, through her children, and into the very heart of France. And in those quiet, candlelit nights, as she held her children, as she whispered prayers, as she planned, Catherine understood that motherhood was her greatest weapon and her greatest burden, and that in the delicate balance of tenderness and ambition, she would find to her destiny. The sun shone brightly over the field of St. Quentin, banners fluttering in the warm summer breeze, knights in gleaming armor, shining like molten silver under the morning light. It was a day of sport, a day of display, a day when power and skill were celebrated, with jousting, with pride, and with spectators holding their breath. Catherine, in her quiet chambers, watched from afar, her heart steady, her mind calm, though she could feel the tension in the earth, as if the earth itself knew the turn of fate that awaited. Henry II, her husband, rode with confidence, his armor polished, his lance steady, his eyes on the target, his mind on glory. The courtiers cheered, the trumpet sounded, the horses pawed at the ground, and the crowd leaned forward, anticipating the clash of steel. Catherine felt the stirrings of fear, not yet fully named, but a shadow at the edges of her mind, for she had always known that life in the court of France was fragile and fleeting. The knights charged, the lances met with a sharp, resonant clang. The crowd gasped, and in an instant, the world shifted. A misjudged strike, a misplaced lance, and Henry fell, blood spilling from a wound that none could immediately see. It all fell as the air turned heavy and the sun seemed to dim. Catherine rushed to his side, her face pale, her hands trembling, but her mind remained clear, calculating, observing. Even in this moment of horror, the physicians gathered, their voices hushed, their hands working with urgency, but the wound was fatal, and the king, the man who had ruled France, was slipping from life as easily as a candle guttering in the wind. The palace was thrown into mourning, but Catherine was not only mourning a husband, she was standing at the precipice of power. Her children, still young, were suddenly heirs to a throne that had been anchored by their father, but now rocked by his absence. Catherine realized that survival in the court would now demand all her cunning, all her patience, all the knowledge she had cultivated in Florence, in secrecy, in shadow. The days that followed were a delicate dance between grief and strategy, between tears and calculation, between public mourning and private plotting. Catherine walked the halls, speaking softly to ministers, to nobles, to those who would shape the regency, and she understood that the throne was now her responsibility, and the kingdom her charge. She moved among the courtiers, her children by her side, her eyes calm, unreadable, her voice soft, but every word, every glance was measured, precise, turning uncertainty into influence, fear into respect. For Catherine knew that power in France was rarely given freely. It had to be taken quietly, skillfully, without revealing the strength that lay beneath the delicate surface. Even as France mourned, she prepared, she gathered allies, she consulted advisors, she reminded the nobles that though Henry was gone, the Medici blood still flowed through the veins of his children and through her own. And in her chambers at night, she held her children close, her heart heavy, her mind alert, whispering to herself that survival required more than tears, required mastery of every human weakness and every opportunity. Henry's death was both an ending and a beginning. The court was unsteady, the nobility anxious, the kingdom uncertain, and in that space, between grief and power, Catherine began her true reign. She was no longer the humiliated bride, no longer the silent observer, no longer merely a mother, she was regent, the queen in all but name, a shadow that would stretch across France, touching every corner of the kingdom, with influence, with fear, with strategy. The field of St. Quentin, where Henry had fallen, was silent now, the banners drooping, the echo of the trumpets faded, but in the quiet, Catherine felt the stirrings of destiny, the first tremors of a power that would shape France, for that, through her children, through her cunning, and through the shadows she had learned to command. And so, the chapter closes with the death of Henry II, the rise of a queen who would hold France in her quiet, unyielding grasp, and the knowledge that the games of the court were now hers to command. The throne was empty, yet the kingdom remained, alive with whispers, with the pulse of power. Catherine, now the widow, stood at the center, quiet, yet commanding, her children at her side, their small hands clutching hers, their eyes reflecting uncertainty. And yet so she was no longer merely a wife, no longer merely a mother, no longer merely a shadow in the court. She was regent, the queen mother, the guardian of the crown, and the ruler of all that France could not yet see. The court was a nest of vipers, each noble plotting, each advisor scheming, each bishop weighing where his allegiance would lie. Catherine moved among them, quietly, smiling softly, her words gentle, yet every phrase was a thread woven into the tapestry of her influence. She learned quickly that fear and respect could be wielded without a raised hand, without a sword drawn, and that patience was a more potent weapon than anger or rash command. Her sons, young Charles and Henry, were the center, and yet the tools of her power. She guided them, not with indulgence, but with careful shaping. Every lesson, every conversation, designed to instill obedience, loyalty, and dependence. The boy King Charles, fragile in mind, easily swayed by fear, yet clever in moments of insight, became her canvas, upon which she painted the future of France. At night, she walked the corridors, the castle quiet, except for the flicker of candlelight and the distant sound of a horse or a guard's footfall. She spoke to no one, yet she whispered to the shadows, planning, listening to the walls, absorbing every echo, every hint of danger. Her mind was a labyrinth, the possibilities, of contingencies, of strategies, where every human weakness was a door, and every secret a key. The court did not yet realize that the Queen Mother was no longer powerless, that the widow of Henry was now the architect of France's destiny. She formed alliances, sometimes through kindness, sometimes through fear, sometimes through promises, and sometimes through quiet intimidation. No one could oppose her openly, for to challenge her was to risk the crown itself and the fragile lives of the young kings who clutched her skirts and mirrored her resolve. She watched the factions, Catholic and Protestant, each vying for influence, each believing themselves clever, and yet unaware that the true game was being played by the woman in the shadow whose patience stretched as endlessly as the night sky. Every marriage proposed, every alliance formed, every court ceremony was a move in her grand strategy, and she measured every glance, every smile, every hesitation, like a masterful player anticipating the next turn. In a game of life and death, Catherine also understood the fragility of human loyalty and the volatility of emotion, and she cultivated spies, couriers, and confidants, women and men alike, who would whisper to her the secrets of the court before they reached her enemies. Her influence grew, slowly filling every corner, until the court could not move without touching her unseen hand. Even the young kings, though fearful, relied on her judgment. Their mother, their regent, the one who navigated the treacherous waters of a kingdom divided, of a people torn by faith, of nobility poisoned with ambition, Catherine guided them through decisions of war, through counsel of peace, through the delicate balance of religion and politics. And though the burden was immense, she bore it with a calm, unyielding strength. The palace at night was her sanctuary and her battlefield, where candles flickered and shadows danced, and she whispered to the empty halls plans for alliances, for marriages, for the survival of her children, and her control over the kingdom. Catherine had become more than a mother, more than a widow, more than a queen. She was the pulse of France, beating quietly through her sons, through her courtiers, through every corridor, every whisper, every hidden glance. And as the night stretched long, she smiled softly to herself, for the kingdom, though fractured, though uncertain, was in her hands. Catherine de Medici was ready to bend it to her will, with patience, with cunning, with the quiet power of a shadow that never falters and never sleeps. France was a kingdom divided. Its streets whispered with prayers, its churches echoed with fear, its markets hummed with suspicion, and in every shadow lurched the presence of conflict. The Queen Mother stood at the center of this storm, her eyes calm, her mind calculating, like a spider poised over a web, feeling every tremor, every movement, every fluttering of destiny. Catholic and Protestant, each faction believed itself righteous, each claimed divine sanction, each hoped to shape the young kings, to bend the nation. Catherine observed the sermons that inflamed hearts, the pamphlets that poisoned minds, the whispered plots in candlelit halls, and she realized that religion was not merely faith, but a ladder to power. She walked through the chapels, her footsteps soft, her presence subtle, listening to priests, gauging the fervor of bishops, watching the sparks of zeal that might ignite into flames of rebellion, and she whispered in corridors unseen to those who trusted her, guiding allegiances, balancing loyalties, ensuring no faction grew so strong that it could threaten her authority. It was a delicate dance, like threading a needle between devotion and ambition, between conscience and survival. For one false move, and the kingdom could erupt into chaos, into devastation. Catherine's mind mapped every possibility, every prayer, every sermon, every hand raised in blessing, and every hand raised in defiance, like pieces on a chessboard, each one waiting to be moved at the perfect moment. She used fear, but not openly, never with a shout or a command. She allowed suspicion to grow, let rumors drift, let small conflicts flare, so that no faction could trust the other, so that the kingdom remained fragile and in need of her guidance. She encouraged alliances, then subtly undermined them. She listened more than she spoke, her silence as sharp as a dagger, as penetrating as any sword. The courtiers whispered that the Queen Mother was cunning, that she played with men's hearts and with faith, as though they were mere toys. And yet, no one could accuse her openly, for the young kings relied on her, their fragile minds shaped by her wisdom and her careful hand. Sometimes she would meet secretly with leaders from both sides, listening to grievances, recording every word, measuring every intention, and in return, she would offer guidance, gentle persuasion, small favors, all designed to keep both factions divided and unsure of each other. The tension in France grew, like clouds gathering before a storm. Yet Catherine's hand was steady. She allowed the storm to build, to threaten, but never to break her control, for she understood that chaos, managed carefully, could secure her position, and that unity, without her mediation, would be dangerous for her power and for her children. At night, she returned to her chambers, holding her children close, their small faces innocent, their eyes reflecting trust, and she whispered plans, like lullabies, softly, gently, yet filled with the weight of strategy, for the kingdom's future was in her hands, and her mind never slept. She thought of every bishop, every preacher, every nobleman, every whisper that might rise to betrayal, and she planned carefully, with patience, with precision, knowing that control of faith was control of life itself. The manipulation of religious factions was not cruelty for its own sake, but survival. A tightrope walked between devotion and dominion, between conscience and necessity, and Catherine, the Queen Mother, balanced it with grace and with ruthless intelligence. Every faction remained in tension, every noble wary, every priest cautious, and all of them relied, even unknowingly, on the calm, calculating presence of the woman who moved through shadows, quiet, yet utterly in command. And as dawn broke over the palace, gold lights spilling across the halls, Catherine watched, her children waking, courtiers stirring, the kingdom breathing, and she knew that her delicate web would hold, for now, and perhaps for decades to come. She was more than mother, more than widow, more than regent. She was the hidden pulse of France, the silent hand that guided chaos, and the master of a kingdom where faith itself was a weapon, was its wielder. In the hidden corners of the palace, where velvet drapes muffled footsteps, and candlelight flickered like quiet stars, Catherine moved, not as a mother, not as a widow, not as a queen in name alone, but as a master of whispers and unseen influence. She had learned the power was not always wielded with armies, or swords, or open decree. Thomas moved silently, through hearts, through desire, through loyalty shaped by subtle touch. The flying squadron was born, a collection of women, beautiful, clever, and loyal to her, trained not in armor, but in persuasion, in seduction, in observation, and in the deadly art of subtle poison. They moved through the court, softly, like shadows, their presence both enticing and disarming, gathering secrets, reading intentions, shaping hearts. Before a man even knew he was manipulated, Catherine watched as her agents whispered into the ears of powerful men, discovering ambitions, hidden alliances, and petty rivalries that could unravel the balance of the kingdom. Thomas, the glance, touch, quiet word, was enough to bend a nobleman's will to her purpose and to her children's protection. The flying squadron was not merely seduction, it was intelligence. It was a network of observation and influence, silent, invisible, yet effective beyond measure. Every dinner, every ball, every whispered conversation was carefully watched, every piece of information recorded in the mind of her agents and delivered to Catherine, who turned it, like a craftsman turning clay, into strategies, into absolute control. It was a delicate balance, for beauty could invite danger, and loyalty could falter, but Catherine trained and guided her women with patience and careful observation, and in return, they were rewarded with her favor, her protection, and the knowledge that they served the true pulse of power in France. Catherine understood that fear alone was never enough, and violence alone was visible and could be countered, but the subtle bending of hearts, the shaping of loyalty, the quiet manipulation of desire was invisible and unstoppable. Through her flying squadron, she could control ministers, nobles, even clergy, without a public decree, without a raised hand, without a clash of swords. At night, she would sit, her children sleeping, and trace in her mind the movements of the court, the alliances, the rivalries, the ambitions, and she would smile softly, knowing that the kingdom was a chessboard, and every piece moved according to her will. Even kings, even princes, even the most powerful men in France could not see the strings that pulled at their hearts, or the quiet influence that shaped their decisions. The flying squadron was not cruel for pleasure, but strategic, It preserved her children, for power, and her control, in a kingdom teetering between war and peace, between faith and rebellion, between loyalty and treachery. The Queen Mother watched quietly from the shadows, her mind awake, her plans unfolding, and in the soft light of candles, she knew that knowledge and subtle influence were the deadliest weapons. Was their master. The corridors whispered of her presence, even when she did not walk them, and the court, though unaware, moved as she directed, like the tide shaped by the moon, silent, unseen, inescapable. And so, the flying squadron became a legend, not for cruelty alone, but for the quiet, patient, and unyielding control it gave Catherine over men, over factions, and over the very destiny of France. The city of Paris lay in uneasy quiet, its streets echoing with whispers, and the faint scent of incense mingling with fear. The Queen Mother walked through the palace halls, her mind sharp, her eyes calm, as she contemplated the fragile balance of her divided kingdom. Her son, Charles IX, sat on the throne, young, impressionable, his mind swayed by doubt and fear, and yet by her guidance. On the whispered urgings of his mother, the Protestant leaders had gathered in the city, their confidence bolstered by the promise of safety, and yet unaware of the storm that was gathering in the shadows, in the chambers, in the mind of Catherine. She approached Charles, her words gentle, her tone persuasive, but her meaning as precise as the blade of a knife. Charles, my son, the kingdom trembles. The faith of our people is threatened. We must act for the stability of France, for the safety of the crown, and for the legacy of our family. The young king, fragile in spirit, trembled not with doubt alone, but with the weight of a decision he did not fully understand. Catherine's voice, soft, soothing, and firm, shaped his fears, guided his thoughts, and in that quiet moment, the decree was formed, one that would forever stain the streets and the memory of France. At midnight, the first blows fell, silent at first, like shadows moving across cobblestones, then louder, more violent, echoing through the narrow streets, the cries of men and women cutting through the stillness of night. Catherine's plans unfolded with the precision of a masterful hand. Her agents, the flying squadron, and loyal nobles, executed her vision, turning fear into obedience and chaos into control. The massacre spread through the city, burning through neighborhoods, through mansions, through homes, with a fire fueled by politics, by fear, and by the ruthless will of a mother securing her children's throne. Every death, every scream, every shadowed corner was a step in Catherine's grand design, and yet she watched with measured detachment, knowing that history will remember her as both protector and destroyer. The young king, Charles IX, was present, his mind clouded, his conscience strained, and Catherine stood at his side, calm guide, shaping his hand, as well as the fate of a divided kingdom. Even as Paris burned with fear, she whispered softly to herself, to her children, to the shadows, that survival sometimes required cruelty, and that power was forged in both love and fire. Through the night, the city the streets became rivers of terror, and Catherine's influence solidified, each step, each decision, binding nobles, binding factions, binding even the young king to her will. And yet, even in the midst of violence, she moved with the grace and the patience that had guided her through widowhood, through regency, through treacherous courtly games. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was not mere revenge, not mere hatred, but calculated, a lesson to the kingdom that order and power were hers to maintain, that the crown and the children of France were protected by the mind of a mother who had learned to wield fear as quietly and as completely as love. By dawn, Paris was changed. forever, its streets silent, her heavy, and Catherine, suppose, her mind already moving, beyond the night, to the challenges, and the power, that lay ahead. She had secured obedience, she had shown strength, and she had bound the young king, and the kingdom, to her vision, the survival, and control. Catherine de Medici, the Queen Mother, the master of whispers, had turned fear into authority, and chaos into power, all in the quiet, measured darkness of one fateful night. The city of Paris still bore the echoes of screams, the shadows of fear lingered, and even the morning sun could not erase the weight that hung over the kingdom. Charles IX, the young king, sat alone in his chambers, his hands trembling, his eyes clouded, the memories of the night etched deep within his mind, like shadows that would not fade. The Queen Mother watched quietly, her heart, her mind calculating, knowing that grief was as much a tool as it was a danger. She had guided him, steered his hand through the massacre, and now she saw the fragile threads of his spirit fraying under the weight, and the realization of power he barely understood. The young king sought solace in whispered confessions, in dreams that betrayed him, yet nothing could cleanse the memory of the streets awash with blood, of friends and enemies alike, fallen in the night by the decree of his own hand. Guided by his mother, Catherine moved gently toward him, her presence soft, her voice low, a lullaby of calm, even as it carried the weight of expectation. My son, the kingdom trembles, but you are its anchor. You must be strong, even when your heart aches, even when the night seems endless, yet could not escape the haunting visions that clung to his mind, every shadow, every whisper, a reminder of the night he would never forget. Sleep eluded him, as it often did, in the days that followed, his dreams filled with echoes, the betrayal of the weight of crowns, and the fragility of life. He walked the corridors, haunted by faces, familiar and strange, the laughter of children, the prayers of the faithful, all twisted in his mind into images of terror that no dawn could dissipate. Catherine understood the necessity of molding him, not with force, but with subtle guidance, whispered counsel, gentle persuasion, careful shaping of decisions and actions, so that even his fear of governance, she spoke to him of duty, of the fragile balance between faith and power, between mercy and strength. And though he feared, he began to see the clarity in her vision, the reasoning behind her cold precision, and the necessity of choices that weighed heavy on every heart. The court noticed his changes, his hesitation, his moments of terror, and his mother's unyielding guidance. They whispered, but none dared oppose her, for they knew that the mind of the king was tethered to hers, and the fate of France to both. As nights passed, Charles grew, not in confidence, but in caution, not in joy, but in awareness. His spirit tempered, like steel forged slowly in fire, and Catherine observed silently, her hand guiding him, her mind shaping the kingdom through his fragile, haunted conscience. Even in solitude, he could not escape the weight of guilt, the shadows of the massacre, and the heavy responsibility of ruling a kingdom torn by faith and bound by fear. Yet Catherine, the Queen Mother, stood beside him, constant presence, a guide through terror, the shadow of control, soft, unyielding, and utterly necessary in this delicate, haunted dance between a mother and her son, between fear and obedience, between grief and governance. Catherine's mastery of human psychology became the anchor that held France together, even as the young king struggled under the weight of conscience and the darkness of memory. And so Charles IX grew, haunted, and molded, his mind forever touched by the night that had marked the city, and by the hand that had guided his trembling fingers toward power and toward a destiny he could barely comprehend. The streets of France, once alive with chatter and commerce, now trembled under the weight of fear and the slow burn of anger. Catherine's night of calculated terror had achieved its immediate purpose, yet the consequences stretched far beyond the palace walls and the cobblestones of Paris. News of the massacre traveled swiftly, carried on whispers, through villages, across provinces, and even across the borders to distant courts, where allies and enemies alike felt the tremor of France's unrest. Protestants, those who had survived, were united, their grief hardening into resolve, their fear transforming into fury, and their loyalty to their faith turning into rebellion. The Catholic factions, though initially triumphant, sensed instability as rumors of retaliation spread through the countryside, and the fragile alliances that Catherine had maintained began to quiver. Like leaves in a storm, the young king, Charles IX, watched in silence, his mind burdened by guilt and fear, and by the knowledge that his mother's guidance had unleashed forces he could no longer fully control. Catherine were of the delicate threads, holding the kingdom together for a war that now could not be avoided, for violence had a momentum all its own, and revenge was a current stronger than decree. The provinces erupted into conflict, villages burned, towns fortified, soldiers marched, and peasants carried arms for the first time against neighbors who had once shared bread and prayers. Every battle, every skirmish was both political and personal, shaped by old grudges and by the memories of that fateful night. Catherine's mind never rested. She navigated the swelling tides, balancing the factions, calculating each move, anticipating retaliation, and trying to maintain the fragile illusion of order. Yet even she knew that control was slipping like sand through fingers, and that the kingdom was entering a prolonged season of war, where her cunning alone could not guarantee peace. The cities and towns became arenas of faith and of blood. Catholic zealots fought Protestant survivors with a fervor sharpened by grief and revenge, and the lines between right and wrong blurred under the pressure of fear and necessity. Catherine observed the rising extremism, the radicalization of both factions, and the unyielding cycle of violence that now defined her realm. Her own tools, her networks, her spies, and her flying squadron could manage intrigue and manipulate hearts, but they could not stop the tidal wave of hatred fueled by memory and vengeance. The young king, fragile in mind, bore the weight of decisions that had become impossible, his guidance shaped by fear, his actions haunted by conscience, and every choice was shadowed by the massacre that he could never undo. Catherine, though resolute, understood that the kingdom was fracturing, that the consequences of her plans were spiraling beyond her immediate control, and that the path was paved with uncertainty. The backlash was relentless. The flames of religious war spread from Paris to the countryside, to towns and cities, to the borders and beyond. France, once united under a crown, was now a kingdom of factions, of fear, and of revenge, where every town, every village, and every noble household was caught in the currents of an escalating conflict. And in this rising storm, Catherine moved with calm determination, her mind mapping every rebellion, every alliance, every whispered threat, and every fleeting loyalty. Her strategy was to survive, to hold the crown, and to protect her children through a season where violence ruled and moral certainty was swallowed by the necessity of power. The kingdom shuddered under the weight of civil war, and yet Catherine stood in the center like a silent, unyielding rock, guiding the currents, shaping the chaos, and watching, as France, forever. In the quiet chambers of the Louvre, where shadows curled like smoke, Catherine de Medici moved with the calm precision of one who had studied every corner of power and fear. Her hands, delicate, yet capable, touch letters, scrolls, and glass, each containing secrets, digital, in the delicate machinery of governance. She had learned early in life that the world was not kind, that alliances were fragile, and that enemies could appear even in the closest embrace. Poison was not merely a weapon, it was a language spoken quietly under the guise of hospitality, of trust, of care. And Catherine was fluent through subtle notes, through whispered guidance, and the careful placement of her agents. She could remove rivals, shape loyalties, and bend decisions without ever raising a sword, without spilling her own blood. Her knowledge of herbs, of alchemy, the potions, was both feared and revered, quiet testament to the power of intellect over brute force. Court moved like a living organism, and Catherine, like a patient surgeon, knew where to intervene, how to influence, how to heal, and, if necessary, how to destroy, with subtle, invisible strokes. Every dinner, every gathering, every banquet was an opportunity to observe, and when required, to act. Her flying squadron played a central role. These women, beautiful, clever, and loyal, carried her influence like a soft wind that bent hearts without breaking them. Through them, Catherine could reach the most stubborn, the most dangerous, the most ambitious, and turn their own desires against themselves with nothing more than a glance, or the faintest trace of a carefully administered potion. Yet her use of poison was never reckless, never indiscriminate. It was always calculated, the measured step. In the broader strategy, the survival and power, she understood the fear must be accompanied by respect. That influence must be subtle, and that loyalty was far stronger when nurtured quietly rather than enforced through violence alone. Catherine sat in her private chambers, late at night, her mind alive with plans, her fingers tracing maps, her eyes scanning letters and lists of names. She whispered softly to herself, to the shadows, to her children sleeping in distant rooms. Every threat, every rival, every ambition must be contained and guided so that the crown and the kingdom remain secure. Through poison, through seduction, through observation, and through whispered counsel, she maintained control over a kingdom fractured by faith, by fear, and by vengeance. Every day, she navigated the treacherous waters of alliances and enmities, her strategies unfolding like delicate threads, woven into a tapestry that only she could see, fully comprehend, and manipulate. Even kings, even nobles, even those closest to her, could not perceive the full extent of her power or the precision of her interventions. And this invisibility was her greatest strength. Catherine de Medici was more than mother, more than widow, more than regent. She was a quiet storm, a shadow in the halls, a master of intrigue, and a wielder of fear, yet utterly undeniable. And as France wavered between war and fragile peace, between loyalty and rebellion, Catherine's hand guided the currents, silently measured, ensuring the power remained in her grasp and in the safety of her children's future. The palace of the Louvre stood silent, its corridors echoing faintly with footsteps of the past and the soft murmurs of those still present. Charles IX, a young king burdened with the weight of decisions he could barely comprehend, walked through the halls, his eyes heavy, his spirit clouded by the memories, blood spilled, and orders given under the guidance of his mother. Catherine stood nearby, a calm shadow in the sunlight, her mind ever calculating, her presence steady, her guidance unwavering. She watched him and knew that the crown he bore was heavier than gold, heavier than ceremony, heavier than any sword. Yet she also knew that his mind, fragile as it was, could be molded, guided, and strengthened if she remained patient and vigilant. The kingdom was fractured, its provinces restless, its nobles ambitious, its peasants fearful, and every decision was fraught with peril. Catherine spoke softly, her words deliberate, her tone a lullaby of caution and strategy. "My son, you must guide with wisdom, even when your heart trembles, even when the night is long, even when fear whispers. In every corner, know that the crown rests not only on your head, but in the steady hand that guides you." Faust listened, yet struggled. Each decision felt like a weight, pressing upon his chest. Each decree, each action, a mirror of the night that had forever altered Paris and his soul. Catherine understood that his hesitation was natural, that trauma shaped the ways a young king could rule, and she used it, not cruelly, but wisely, to instill caution, prudence, and dependence on her guidance. Together, they navigated the treacherous waters of governance, balancing the demands of nobility, of justice, and of survival. Each council, each audience with a foreign envoy, each response to rebellion was carefully measured, her voice a gentle tide that guided his decisions, her presence a silent anchor, keeping the young king and the kingdom from drifting into chaos entirely. Yet the weight of guilt and memory never fully left him, and Catherine recognized that these shadows would forever shape the man he was becoming and the monarch he would be forced to remain. She watched over him with maternal care and political precision, understanding that fear, if balanced with guidance, could create a ruler who was cautious, strategic, and utterly reliant on her wisdom. The courtiers whispered of the young king's hesitation, his trembling hand, and his haunted eyes, but none challenged the Queen Mother, for they understood that in the heart of her guidance lay the pulse of France itself. In private, Catherine traced the intricate web of alliances, loyalties, and factions, every whispered threat, every ambition, every spark of rebellion she saw and accounted for. And she whispered to her son the counsel he needed, the words that softened the tremors in his heart and shaped his governance through the lens of her experience, through fear, through the shadows of massacre. Catherine and Charles IX continued their delicate dance, the mother guiding, the son learning, and the kingdom teetering between order and chaos. She understood that history was written not only in victory, but in survival, and that the hand that steered the frightened young king could shape the future of France for years to come. Even as unrest simmered, even as factions prepared, and even as Europe watched, Catherine's mind never rested. Her vigilance, her calculation, her quiet orchestration held the fragile threads of governance together in a kingdom forever changed by ambition, fear, and the shadows of power. In the quiet halls of the Louvre, where candlelight flickered softly and shadows stretched across marble floors, Catherine de Medici moved like a conductor, guiding an orchestra of invisible notes, each delicate, yet profoundly powerful. She had learned that armies could win battles, but intelligence won kingdoms. Her flying squadron, her trusted women of influence, had already shaped hearts and bent wills. But Catherine knew that survival demanded more than whispers and subtle poison. She expanded her network beyond the palace, beyond Paris, reaching into provinces, into markets and churches, where gossip flowed like rivers and secrets hid in plain sight. Spies moved silently, carrying messages hidden in letters, in embroidered patterns, each delivering insight about rebellion, intrigue, and loyalty. Catherine's mind absorbed it all like a sponge, turning fragments into strategy, turning whispers into plans, turning fear into power. Her agents were everywhere, in noble salons, in taverns, even in convents, not with swords, but with eyes, and subtle persuasion. The ambitions of nobles, the fears of ministers, the hidden alliances, and the fragile loyalties that could crumble at a single word or the faintest touch of influence. Catherine herself remained calm, invisible, a quiet storm shaping the currents of France, through letters coded with care, through agents loyal to her cause, and through subtle acts of manipulation. She controlled information, she guided outcomes, and she turned chaos into an instrument of governance. Even the king, Charles IX, depended on her network for decisions made under duress, for guidance in the storm of civil war, and for insight into factions he could not see and could not trust to advisors whose loyalty was uncertain. Catherine's espionage was an extension of her mind, a living, breathing system that reached every corner of her realm and gave her a certainty that few could ever challenge. At night, she reviewed reports, she mapped rebellions, she noted alliances forming, and she smiled softly, knowing that every agent, every whisper, every piece of knowledge was a thread in the intricate tapestry, the power she wove around her children, around her kingdom, around herself. Her intelligence network was not just about control, it was about survival, about ensuring that no threat, no ambition, no secret could rise unnoticed and threaten the crown or the fragile stability she fought so tirelessly to maintain. Catherine, the Queen Mother, the master of subtlety, understood that knowledge was the ultimate weapon, and that the hand that wielded it, quietly, patiently, and with precision, would hold the fate of France firmly within its grasp. The kingdom shimmered with tension, every noble, every peasant, every merchant, unaware that their fates were being carefully observed and quietly influenced by the unseen hand of Catherine de Medici. And as the night deepened, she remained ever watchful, ever patient, ever the silent architect of power, of influence, and of survival. In the quiet chambers, where sunlight fell softly through tall windows, Henry, the youngest son, grew beneath the watchful eye of his mother, Catherine de Medici. He was delicate, sensitive, with eyes that reflected curiosity, and a mind shaped by shadows, the weight of a kingdom, and the whispers of history. Catherine watched him, careful, gentle, yet never relinquishing her guidance. She understood that shaping a king was not merely teaching him rules or giving orders. It was molding thought, instilling caution, and nurturing the instincts that would govern an entire nation. She spoke softly, her words weaving lessons through stories, through parables, through quiet counsel about loyalty, power, and survival. Henry, remember always that a crown is not merely gold, nor a throne merely wood. It is responsibility, it is shadow, it is a burden that shapes the soul and tests the heart. The young prince absorbed her words, his mind alert, his imagination alive. Yet he also sensed the weight of expectation, the quiet demands that came from being born a son of France and a child of Catherine. Through gentle influence, through subtle instruction, and the patient weaving of advice and guidance, Catherine shaped his perception of power, showed him that diplomacy could be stronger than the sword, that persuasion could be mightier than force, and that intelligence was often the sharpest weapon of all. Even as France wavered on the brink of rebellion and war, Henry learned to observe, to listen, to anticipate, and to understand the currents of human desire and the fragility of alliances. Catherine guided him not to instill fear, but to cultivate discernment, to shape a ruler who could survive in a kingdom fractured by faith and bound by politics. Late at night, she would sit beside his bed, whispering histories and moral lessons, stories of kings who fell because they could not see the webs around them, and of leaders who survived because their minds were sharper than any blade. Through this careful shaping, Henry began to understand that true rulership was not about domination or fear, but about perception, intelligence, and knowing when to act and when to remain silent. And Catherine, ever patient, ever vigilant, watched the growth of her son, knowing that her guidance, the survival, and the stability of France were like threads in a vast, fragile tapestry. A tapestry woven with ambition, with fear, with power, and with the quiet, unyielding hand of the Queen Mother. The halls of the Louvre echoed with soft footsteps and hushed conversations where alliances were forged, not with swords, but with words, contracts, and the careful arrangement of families. Catherine de Medici moved through these corridors like a masterful weaver, threading together the fates of kingdoms with the strands of marriage and the quiet power of connection. She understood that love was often a fleeting luxury, but that marriages that could bind houses, secure loyalty, and shape the very future of France. Every son, every daughter was key to unlock alliances or to secure peace in a kingdom teetering between faith and conflict. Princesses were sent to distant courts with dowries carefully calculated, with instructions whispered about diplomacy and observation, about the subtle arts of persuasion and influence. Catherine's sons were guided toward unions that strengthened ties, that pacified factions, that reinforced her web of control, woven tightly around the fractured realm. The Queen Mother observed every letter exchanged, every gaze held in court, every whispered promise, and every quiet maneuver that could shift loyalty or spark intrigue. Her knowledge of the human heart was unparalleled. She knew how ambition could be tamed, how desire could be redirected, how jealousy could be transformed into an instrument of her design. Even the grandest banquets were opportunities to place alliances, to watch reactions, and to adjust plans with the subtlety of a chess master, moving pawns and knights without ever revealing the full strategy. Through marriages, Catherine extended her influence beyond the palace walls, beyond Paris, to distant courts, where her daughters wore crowns and carried the weight of her vision with quiet grace. Every union, every alliance, was a calculated step in the preservation of her power and in the survival of her children. Amidst a kingdom riven by religion, fear, and ambition, she whispered guidance to her daughters, teaching them the subtle arts of diplomacy, the silent strength in patient observation, and the power of knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. And through these unions, through these carefully arranged connections, Catherine shaped the fate, not only of her family, but of France itself, like an unseen hand, turning the wheels of destiny with patience, precision, and quiet mastery. In the quiet of the night, she reflected on the paths she had laid for her children, the alliances secured, the enemies placated, and the fragile peace maintained. Through the delicate art, the marriage, and the subtle dance of influence and control, Catherine, the Queen Mother, knew that while swords could conquer and armies could destroy, it was the union of hearts and houses that shaped kingdoms and secured her enduring power. In the shadowed corridors of history, the city of Paris lay under a still night sky. Stars scattered like distant candles, and the Seine whispered softly, its waters carrying reflections of the silent moon. Yet beneath this calm, the storm of intent gathered quietly inside the heart of the Louvre, and in the shadowed corridors, where Catherine de Medici walked with measured steps, her mind alive with calculation, the young king, Charles IX, stood trembling, his crown heavy upon his head, his heart heavy with doubt, and yet his mother's words, soft, persistent, guiding, had shaped his hesitation into resolve, or perhaps into fear, so closely interwoven that he could not distinguish one from the other. Catherine's voice was gentle, like a lullaby in the dark. Charles, you must act for the stability of the realm, for the safety of the crown, for the honor of our family, and the legacy of France. Every word was carefully chosen, a gentle nudge toward the impossible, a shaping of conscience, to authorize acts that would echo through centuries. The city, once filled with laughter and market cries, was hushed now, as nobles and citizens, oblivious to the coming storm, prepared for ordinary nights, for ordinary prayers, never knowing that the threads of destiny were being pulled toward tragedy. The courtiers who survived felt only subtle changes, tension in the air, a quiet unease. Yet in the chambers of power, the plan was set, the orders whispered, the preparations complete, for a purge, meticulously calculated and devastatingly precise. The first moves were quiet, almost imperceptible, a message delivered, a guard redirected, a noble lured into a trap, and then the inevitable unfolded, like the slow turning of a wheel that could not be stopped. Charles IX signed the letters with trembling hands, his mind clouded with fear, with obedience, and with the weight of history pressing down upon him, and in that moment he became both king and instrument of an act that would stain the heart of France forever. The night deepened, candles flickered in windows, and Paris was transformed from a city of life to a stage for fear, for revenge, for the massacre was not a sudden eruption, but a slow, deliberate unfolding, guided by whispers, by fear, by power, and by the cold, precise mind of Catherine de Medici. Every street, every alley, every noble house became a theater of fate, and yet, to Catherine, this was not chaos, but a symphony, where each note, each movement, was carefully arranged to secure control and preserve her children. And the panic, the running, the shadows moving under lamplight, all blended into the night like a dark lullaby. And in the palace, Catherine observed, her eyes calm, her mind calculating, as the kingdom she ruled was remade through fear and obedience. And as the first dawn approached, casting pale light over the city, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had begun, its ripples spreading outward, through France, through hearts, through history itself. A night that would be remembered, not for heroism, not for courage, but for power, for strategy, and for the enduring shadow of a mother guiding her king through the darkest currents of human ambition and fear. The streets of Paris, once familiar, now echoed with silence, broken only by the distant cries and the whisper of wind, carrying the weight of a city forever changed. Catherine de Medici sat in her private chambers, her eyes calm, her hands folded, her mind mapping every ripple, every consequence of the night that had passed. Charles IX walked the corridors of the palace, haunted by the images he could not erase, faces of nobles and friends, lost to fear and orders, the weight of guilt pressing on a young king's shoulders, shaping him even as he struggled to remain sovereign in his own mind. The kingdom was fractured, factions arose, old alliances dissolved, and yet Catherine's control remained like a shadow over the chaos, quiet but pervasive, guiding the trembling currents of power and fear. Nobles whispered, nations watched, and the people trembled beneath the weight of uncertainty. Every village, every town, aware that France had changed forever, that the balance of faith and power had been violently reset. Catherine understood that even success came at a cost, that power achieved through fear was fragile, and that the young king must learn to navigate not only loyalty, but suspicion and guilt that haunted both him and the throne. She moved softly through her chambers, whispering guidance to her sons, teaching them that survival required strategy, that influence required patience, and that even in victory, shadows lingered, reminding all of the price of power. The city recovered slowly, its life returning, but the memory of that night was etched into walls, into hearts, into the very soul of France. And in the palace, Catherine's mind never rested, mapping every ripple, anticipating every reaction, ensuring that even as chaos reigned, her influence remained absolute. Through whispered counsel, through measured restraint, through intelligence and observation, she maintained control over her sons, over nobles, over the kingdom itself, teaching a lesson. The power was both a gift and a burden. The aftermath was quiet, yet palpable, like the lingering echo of a bell in an empty cathedral, reminding all that history is shaped not only by action, but by the careful orchestration of strategy and the unseen hand of those who guide it. Catherine, the Queen Mother, sat in silence, her eyes reflecting candlelight, her mind plotting, her heart steady, knowing that she had changed France forever, and that the threads of power still rested in her careful, watchful hands. The young king, Charles IX, walked the halls of the palace, his footsteps soft, yet echoing the weight of decisions made and lives lost, haunted, reflecting memories that would not fade, faces of the dead, friends, nobles, strangers, all mingling in shadows. Inside his mind, sleep came fitfully, and when it did, it brought dreams, not of joy, but of screams, of corridors filled with blood, and the whispers of orders he had given, or had been persuaded to give, by his mother's calm, unyielding guidance. Catherine watched from her chambers nearby, her hands folded, her mind pent, her heart steady, for she understood the trauma was both a burden and a tool to shape the king into a ruler, careful, deliberate, and dependent on her counsel. He questioned himself, every word, every decision, every alliance, his conscience, a mirror reflecting fear and the moral cost of rulership. Even in daylight, the palace seemed a theater of shadows, where every smile could hide betrayal, every gesture could mask intent, and every whisper could carry the weight of life or death. Faust learned to navigate, but the weight of the massacre and of governing under the careful, watchful hand of Catherine pressed continually upon his spirit. He sought counsel, yet feared judgment from advisors, nobles, and even his own mother, whose wisdom was undeniable and whose influence was as constant as the stars, silent yet guiding, shaping every thought, every fear, every choice. In quiet moments, he would wander through the gardens, the fountains reflecting the sky, and ponder the fragility of life and the fragility of how the laughter of courtiers seemed distant, the cheer hall, and he felt the endless echo of the consequences of a night that had changed France forever. Catherine, patient, whispered to him through counsel, guidance, and subtle influence, teaching him that a king's mind must balance dread and prudence, fear and strategy, and that the crown was not merely an ornament, but a weight to be carried with measured care. Through this careful shaping, through observation, Charles IX slowly became a ruler, aware of the fragility of life, the volatility of power, and the subtle necessity of reliance on the hand that had guided him from the beginning. The young king's mind was never at rest, yet in that unrest, he learned vigilance, he learned caution, and he learned the inescapable shadow of his mother, the Queen Mother, whose influence would mark his reign and France itself forever. France was a kingdom divided, its faith split between Catholic devotion and Protestant reform, that lingered like a quiet storm, waiting for a spark. Catherine de Medici understood this better than most, that belief could be both anchor and weapon, that loyalty could be guided and fear could be cultivated. She moved carefully through the tangled web of priests, ministers, nobles, and her children's education, weaving faith into politics, not for piety alone, but for survival, for influence, for control. Letters were sent, promises whispered, alliances subtly shifted as she balanced factions against each other, ensuring no single group could gain enough strength to challenge her authority. The masses sensed only confusion, uncertainty, and yet, in the royal chambers, Catherine's strategy was precise, a dance of shadows, where each faction believed they held advantage, while she held the reins, hidden, yet utterly controlling. Her sons, taught and guided, observed the power of faith, and how fear could enforce obedience, and how hope could inspire loyalty. Catherine whispered lessons, softly, like lullabies of caution, that shaped their understanding of power and of influence. The city streets were filled with the quiet tension of worshippers divided, priests cautious, merchants fearful, and Catherine watched the interplay of devotion and fear, like a gardener tending to fragile blossoms, ensuring growth and pruning rebellion through processions, sermons, and edicts, through calculated appearances and whispered warnings. She maintained a delicate balance, keeping France in controlled chaos, yet steady enough to remain under her guidance. Who was both shield and sword, the tool for persuasion, the method of control, and Catherine wielded it with a quiet grace and a keen intellect, ensuring that every faction remained dependent and no threat could rise unseen. In the hush of twilight, as candles flickered across the palace and the distant bells tolled, Catherine reflected on the delicate interplay of belief and power, knowing that her subtle orchestration would shape the hearts and minds of her kingdom for years to come. In the shadowed corridors of the Louvre, where silence draped itself like velvet, Catherine de Medici's influence reached far, beyond the eyes of nobles, beyond the gaze of kings. Her network, known to few as the Flying Squadron, was a collection of women whose beauty, and intelligence were instruments of power, quietly wielded under the watchful hand of the Queen Mother. These women moved like whispers, capturing attention, shaping desires, turning affection into influence and favor into obedience. Every glance, every whispered word, every carefully delivered smile was a thread in the intricate tapestry of politics that Catherine wove with patience and precision. Courtiers and nobles, unaware that their hearts were being guided and their secrets gently coaxed, revealed themselves through conversations, through confidences shared, through trust earned, and then quietly leveraged. To Catherine's design, the Flying Squadron was not merely seduction, but intelligence, observation, subtle manipulation, and the cultivation of loyalty through personal connection, through trust, through the art of knowing what each noble desired and what each feared. Catherine herself never needed to step forward, for her agents acted as extensions of her mind, her will, and her strategy. Through them, she discovered plots, uncovered alliances, and ensured that her children and her crown remained secure. Even the most powerful men could be influenced without force, without threat, simply by a carefully placed word, a gentle touch of persuasion, or the soft shadow of desire, guided by the quiet wisdom of the Queen Mother. In this way, Catherine controlled the currents of loyalty and ambition, as easily as the wind moves through trees, subtle yet undeniable, shaping the destiny of individuals and the kingdom alike. And as night descended, casting long shadows across the palace, the flying squadron moved silently, their influence spreading like the faintest echo, ensuring that Catherine's power was absolute and eternal within the walls of France. In the stillness of the palace, where candlelight danced softly across marble floors, Catherine de Medici approached the young king, Charles IX, her voice calm, her presence steady, like a river flowing quietly, guiding the fragile boat of his conscience. "Charles," she whispered, her tone gentle, almost like a lullaby, "to protect the crown, to preserve the realm, to secure the legacy of our family, you must act." Each word was carefully chosen, weaving persuasion into the fabric of fear and duty, blurring the lines between morality and necessity. He trembled beneath the weight of responsibility and the shadow of his mother's influence, her calm certainty shaping his hesitation into resolve, or perhaps into acquiescence, so that he could not see where choice ended and obedience began. Catherine reminded him of threats lurking unseen, of rebellion forming quietly, of the fragility of order and the necessity of action. Her words soft, pierced, guiding the young king's thoughts toward the path she had long prepared. "Charles," she murmured, "this is not cruelty, but preservation. This is not vengeance, but protection. And through your decision, France will endure." The king's hands shook as they hovered over letters, bearing the weight of lives and the authority of the crown. And yet, he could not deny the quiet certainty of his mother's reasoning, nor the unseen power that had guided him through fear and responsibility. And so, with a breath that seemed to carry centuries of expectation, Charles IX signed the authorization, transforming his hesitation into decree, to signature, to spark that would ignite the night and send ripples through history. Catherine watched silently, her calm gaze unwavering, knowing that the path had been set, that the wheels of fate were in motion, and that the delicate threads of influence, persuasion, and power she had woven would guide the kingdom through the storm. The palace seemed to hold its breath as the night awaited the unfolding of decisions made in shadows, by hands trembling under the weight of history itself. And in that quiet moment, the young king and the queen mother became co-authors of a night that would forever change the heart of France and the lives of countless souls caught in the currents of ambition, fear, and survival. Night fell over Paris, soft and quiet, the streets bathed in silver moonlight, and the Seine whispered gently, as though warning the city of shadows to come. Yet beneath the calm, there was heavy, charged with anticipation and fear, for in the hidden corners of the Louvre, Catherine's plan had begun to breathe and move like a living thing. The first signals were subtle, a guard absent from his post, a messenger delayed, a door left ajar, small omissions that would allow chaos to enter where once there was order. Across the streets, the cries began softly, shouts in alleyways, doors breaking, and the echo of hurried footsteps reverberating through narrow lanes. The city awakening to the nightmare that had been set in motion by careful words and signed orders. Charles IX watched from the palace, his face pale, his heart heavy, each sound from below a reminder of his hand in the unfolding horror, the weight of life and death pressing upon a young king. As Catherine's influence guided him through the storm, the streets filled quickly with panic, flickering lanterns casting dancing shadows, shapes moving through smoke and fear, and the massacre became a tide, rising slowly, relentlessly, consuming the lives of nobles, merchants, and citizens alike. Yet even as violence spread, Catherine's mind remained calm, an architect of chaos, watching the balance of power shift with precise observation. Every act, every scream, every flash of fire, part of the intricate plan that would secure her children and her crown. The city seemed to twist under the weight of terror and uncertainty as neighbors turned against neighbors, and faith became both shield and target. Protestant homes, Catholic houses, each moved in the tide of suspicion, and every choice had consequences beyond measure. Even the night itself seemed to pause, holding its breath, as Paris became a theater of death and strategy, the streets echoing with the sounds of both fear and obedience. While in the palace, Catherine watched silently, a calm eye in the storm, ensuring that every ripple served her purpose. Through shadowed alleys, through candlelit windows, through the hearts of men and the whispers of women, her plan unfolded flawlessly, like a symphony of precision, fear and power in the dance of survival. And as the first light of dawn softly caressed the rooftops, the city was changed forever, a night of horror that would echo through history, forever tied to the name of Catherine de Medici and the young king who bore the weight of her calculated guidance. As dawn stretched its pale fingers over the rooftops of Paris, the city lay in uneasy silence, its streets scarred by fear, its air thick with whispers and trembling hearts. Yet Paris was only the beginning, for the news of the night's horrors flowed outward like a river, spreading ripples of dread to every corner of the kingdom. In distant towns, villagers whispered about friends and neighbors lost, about the fragility of faith and the peril of loyalty, and the air of uncertainty crept into every household, every market, every church. Nobles in provinces received letters bearing grim tidings, their eyes wide, their hands trembling, and their minds racing with fear and calculation. For even the powerful knew that the shadow of Catherine's plan reached far beyond Paris. Catholic and Protestant alike felt the trembling currents of terror and suspicion as communities turned inward, trust eroded, alliances shattered, and fear became both protector and predator. Catherine watched from her palace, her calm mind charting every ripple, every wave of panic, every moment of uncertainty. She understood that chaos could be a shield and a tool to maintain control over a kingdom fractured by faith and fear. Her sons felt the weight too, learning the painful that power is fragile, that loyalty is fleeting, and that survival requires both strategy and patience. The countryside was alive with hushed rumors, fires of mistrust smoldering, every village a mirror of Paris terror, and Catherine's orchestration ensured that no region felt entirely safe, that every hand and every heart was subtly guided by fear, by rumor, by influence. Even in this spread of darkness, there was method, a deliberate shaping of perception and allegiance. And through it all, Catherine's vision remained unbroken, her children secured, her authority intact, and her power absolute. The kingdom of France was changed, its social fabric stretched, its hearts tempered, and its rulers taught lessons in vigilance through the unfolding of a night that would haunt generations and echo through the corridors of history itself. And in the quiet of distant provinces, where the sun rose slowly and birds hesitated to sing, the memory of that night carried on the wind a soft but persistent reminder. The fear and the careful hand of power can touch every corner, even the farthest heart of a kingdom. In the quiet chambers of the palace, Catherine de Medici reflected, her mind tracing the delicate threads of power and consequence woven through the events of the night and the days that followed. The kingdom was no longer simply hers to guide, its factions wary, its nobles cautious, its subjects fearful, and yet Catherine's hand remained unseen, moving with precision through every whispered word, every careful alliance, her sons, bore the weight of history. Charles IX, haunted by visions of faces lost, a crown heavy with guilt, and decisions that could not be undone. Henry, younger, impressionable, observed his brother, observed his mother, learning both the power and the burden of the monarchy. Political currents shifted, alliances realigned, and fear became both weapon and shield. For Catherine, her influence over her sons, both a protection and a subtle form of control. Across France, foreign powers watched, aware that the monarchy was tested, its strength measured in whispers and rumors, and in the fragile obedience of its people. Within the palace, every council, every meeting was shadowed by the memory of the massacre and the awareness that decisions now carried heavier weight than ever before. Catherine taught, through example and guidance, through subtle coercion, that ruling required balance between fear and favor, obedience and loyalty, and that her sons must navigate these currents with vigilance and patience. Her authority remained intact, yet the cost was clear. The kingdom's heart, forever altered, the monarchy, forever marked by tragedy, and her sons' minds, shaped by shadowed experience. Even as Paris returned to a semblance of life, and France attempted to recover from the tremors of fear, Catherine's political acumen ensured that her hand remained at the helm, guiding and controlling the fragile vessel of power. Through all of this, the young king's hesitancy, the whispers of nobles, and the watchful eyes of foreign powers, Catherine remained a calm, quiet presence, the Queen Mother, whose mind measured every move, and whose influence extended far beyond the palace walls. France was forever changed, its heart tested, its rulers tempered, and Catherine, ever vigilant, stood at the center, the silent force, guiding history through shadows and light. The palace was silent now, but not peaceful. Its halls echoed with unspoken fears and memories too heavy to speak aloud. Charles IX walked slowly through corridors, each step measured, each breath weighted by the night that had passed, by the cries that still lingered in the shadows of his mind. Courtiers moved cautiously, their smiles thin, their laughter muted, for even the most loyal felt the trembling currents of fear and suspicion running like veins through the palace. Could not escape the echoes. Faces of the slain haunted his vision, and even in sunlight, their eyes followed him, a reminder that decisions made in fear left scars not just on the body, but on the mind. His mother, Catherine, observed him with quiet calculation, aware that trauma could be shaped, molded to reinforce control and instill vigilance necessary for rulership. The courtiers felt the weight, their ambitions checked, their whispers cautious, for they knew that any misstep could be observed not only by the Queen Mother, but by the mind of a king, forever shadowed by the night's horrors. Sleep offered no solace. Dreams were filled with shadows and flickering candlelight, screams echoing softly, the faintest sound, able to awaken memories and stir anxiety. Charles learned to measure his thoughts, to temper his emotions, to rely on counsel, and to anticipate betrayal, for the mind scarred by fear could become vigilant, and in vigilance there was power. And so the palace became a theater of quiet tension, each person performing with caution, their steps choreographed by memory and fear, by loyalty and observation, under the ever-watchful eyes of the Queen Mother. Through the cells was shaped, his psyche tempered, his resolve tested, and the kingdom learned that the echoes of one night could influence the hearts and minds of all who lived beneath the crown. The psychological toll was invisible, yet pervasive, like mist settling over a river, soft, persistent, reminding all the power and fear, and that the mind of a ruler is the truest battlefield of all. After the night of shadows, after the tremors of fear had settled, Catherine de Medici moved quietly, like a river smoothing stones, careful, deliberate, unseen, yet shaping everything in her path. Her sons were fragile reeds, swayed by grief, fear, and uncertainty, and yet, under her guidance, they began to stand, shaped by her counsel and the steady, invisible hand of her influence. Councils convened, advisors whispered, and Catherine's voice, soft, persuasive, wove through decisions, her wisdom and subtle coercion, ensuring loyalty and securing obedience. She repaired alliances, smoothed tensions, and balanced power between factions, careful not to let one rise too high. For she knew that unchecked ambition could unravel all she had wrought. Her network, both men and women, agents and courtiers, moved with precision, their loyalty anchored in admiration and dependence, for Catherine's mind saw all. And planned all. Charles the Knife, now tempered by trauma, began to listen, to observe, and act with caution. His decisions guided by shadows of memory and the gentle pressure of maternal influence. The kingdom itself moved slowly toward stability, yet it was a fragile stability, constructed on subtle manipulation, on calculated fear, and the careful orchestration of the Queen Mother's intelligence. Through the corridors, through whispered conversations, through letters and subtle gestures, Catherine's influence remained absolute. Her vision for France, shaped not only by power, but by the understanding of the human mind and the fragile nature of authority itself. And as the sun rose, casting gentle light upon the palace, she observed her kingdom, a steady eye in the ever-shifting currents, ensuring that the crown remained secure and that her sons and her legacy would endure. In this quiet consolidation, there was both triumph and the subtle knowledge. The power is a river that must be guided carefully, else it will overflow and sweep everything away. In the quiet chambers of strategy, Catherine de Medici contemplated the delicate threads of family, power, and diplomacy, like a weaver at her loom, each thread chosen with care, each knot placed with foresight. Her children were not merely heirs, but instruments of influence, their marriages, tools to extend reach, to bind allies, and to temper rivals. Princes and princesses moved along carefully plotted paths, their unions choreographed, to strengthen bonds between powerful houses, to secure loyalty, and to expand Catherine's subtle influence. Each alliance was a quiet act of power, a soft but unyielding assertion that the Medici name would intertwine with the currents of European royalty, shaping politics without force, without open conflict. The young king observed these arrangements, how marriage could be as potent as armies and edicts, how love, duty, and duty masquerading as love could bend kingdoms to a careful hand and a subtle mind. Cross borders, letters carried proposals, promise, and quiet threats, binding families and ensuring that Catherine's reach extended beyond France, into the courts of Italy, Spain, and beyond, through celebrations, weddings, and whispered negotiations. She guided her children into positions of strength, their influence amplified by connections she had orchestrated, carefully, delicately, like a river shaping the land over time. Even as Paris healed and France stabilized, the subtle power of dynastic alliances ensured that Catherine's influence remained enduring, her legacy woven into the very fabric of European royalty. And so, through marriage and careful planning, through patience and observation, Catherine de Medici secured not only the present, but the future of her family and the kingdom she had shaped. Through shadows, guidance, and the quiet art of influence, the halls of the palace were silent now, yet they carried whispers, echoes of decisions made and power exercised. with both subtlety and unyielding resolve. Catherine de Medici had moved through shadows, through fear and fascination, shaping the minds and hearts of all who dwelled beneath the crown. Her presence was felt even when she was not in the room. The quiet weight that guided conversations, tempered ambition, and enforced loyalty without a raised voice, without overt command, was one instrument, a gentle reminder that authority could be absolute, that disobedience carried consequences, and that the Queen Mother's eyes could see through pretense, through hesitation, through hidden intent. Respect was another, or not merely by title, but through intelligence, through observation, through a careful understanding of human nature, and the delicate balance between compliance and loyalty, courtiers, nobles, and even foreign emissaries. Learn quickly that Catherine's influence was neither cruel nor arbitrary, but precise, measured, and enduring. Her sons internalized these lessons, understanding slowly that the crown required wisdom, that power demanded patience, and that authority was as much about subtlety as it was about command. And as the candles flickered, casting gentle shadows across the marble floors, the palace remained a kingdom shaped by fear and respect, a realm guided by intelligence, and a legacy that would linger long after the voices of the night had quieted. Catherine de Medici stood at the center, the quiet force whose influence had been felt in every decision, every whisper, every shadow of the court, a testament to the enduring and complex power of subtlety, strategy, and wisdom. Even in sleep, her name carried weight, a reminder that authority can be absolute when tempered by intelligence and the delicate art of combining fear with respect. Morning light filtered softly through the tall windows of the Louvre, casting long, delicate shadows across the polished floors, and the palace was quiet, yet heavy with anticipation. Catherine de Medici moved with her usual calm, her mind tracing the currents of loyalty, power, and fear for the Huguenot leaders who had gathered under the fragile promise of peace, their fates now resting in her hands. Messages had been sent, whispers carried through the corridors, and couriers moved silently, bearing letters sealed with authority and warning. As Catherine considered the delicate balance between political necessity and human consequence, each leader stood unaware of the weight of the decision that would shape not only their lives, but the kingdom itself, and the fragile trust that had barely begun to form. Catherine's voice was calm as she addressed her advisors, each word deliberate, weaving strategy with subtlety, guiding action without revealing the full shadow of what was to come. The Huguenot leaders were invited into rooms, their steps echoing softly on marble floors, unaware of the silence that preceded the storm, their hearts steady, yet unaware of the currents moving silently around them. Through Catherine's orchestration, each move was precise, each action calculated, her mind anticipating the reactions, the alliances, and the inevitable fear that would grip the city and spread outward. And as she watched, from her quiet chamber, the chessboard of human lives shifted under her guidance, each leader a piece, each decision a move, and the kingdom's future resting delicately on the hands of the Queen Mother. The air in the palace was heavy with tension, yet Catherine remained serene, in the storm, knowing that power was not only seized, but managed with patience, foresight, and subtlety. Even as the city slept, and the first whispers of fear trickled into the streets, the fate of those leaders was determined, not with haste, but with the quiet precision of a mind accustomed to steering history through shadow and light. Dawn had barely touched the rooftops when Paris awoke to a different world. Streets that once held the chatter of merchants now whispered with fear and the soft murmur of uncertainty. Windows remained shuttered, doors bolted, and the river Seine flowed quietly, as if mourning the city's fragile peace, its waters reflecting a sky tinged with the memory of night's terror. Citizens moved cautiously, their steps careful, deliberate, every glance over the shoulder, a quiet acknowledgement that the shadows of yesterday still lingered. In every alley, in every corner, in every heartbeat, the Huguenot families grieved quietly, their homes marked by absence and loss, while whispers of betrayal and the weight of authority settled over the city like a soft, suffocating mist. Catherine watched from her chambers, her calm gaze sweeping the city, measuring fear, gauging loyalty, and ensuring that the currents of influence continued to flow exactly as she intended. Courtiers and nobles shared hushed words behind closed doors, aware that the night had shifted power, yet uncertain of who could be trusted. For even allies moved carefully, their steps measured by shadows of doubt. The young king felt the weight of every life lost, of every tear shed, and yet Catherine's guidance kept him steady, her hand shaping his thoughts, turning fear into vigilance and hesitation into strategy. Even the city itself seemed altered, its rhythm slowed, its pulse measured, as Paris absorbed the echoes of its own fragility, and learned that survival was not just in strength, but in observation and careful attention. And as the day unfolded and light spilled into streets, the quiet realization took hold that Catherine's influence was both subtle and absolute, her orchestration of events, ensuring that fear and respect were in the fabric of the city. In this moment, Paris became both classroom and mirror, reflecting the careful balance between power and morality, between control and chaos, and reminding all that the actions of one could shape the destiny of many. The grand halls of France echoed with quiet murmurs. The nobility gathered, their voices low, their gestures cautious, for the night's horrors had left an invisible mark on both mind and heart. Some bowed their heads, measured their words, aware that loyalty was no longer assumed, but tested by every glance, every whispered message. Sought opportunity, calculating gains from fear, measuring how shadows might shift alliances and elevate their position or safeguard their families in a kingdom now delicate as a glass vessel balanced on the edge of a table. Catherine's presence was everywhere, felt in every gesture, every glance exchanged, and her reputation as a master of strategy and subtle power cast both awe and trepidation across the courtiers. Letters traveled swiftly from Paris to distant estates, spreading not just news, but also the soft tremor of fear and speculation. Nobles considered their next moves, their alliances, their loyalty, their survival. The young king watched quietly, learning from every expression, every hesitation, every calculated smile. That power was both a shield and a sword, and that survival required both courage and observation. Some nobles whispered of rebellion, others whispered of cautious obedience, yet all recognized that Catherine's hand was present even when unseen, and that her network extended farther than eyes could reach. The court became a theater where fear and ambition, the dance measured by subtle cues and quiet gestures, every noble aware that one misstep could ripple through influence and reach the palace. Catherine's influence was reflected in their hesitation, in their careful plotting, and in the recognition that respect and fear could guide even the proudest into careful obedience. As night approached again, the nobility retired to their chambers, their minds heavy with calculation and the quiet understanding that the balance of power was delicate, and that one woman's wisdom had reshaped the kingdom With subtlety, precision, and enduring influence, the palace walls stood tall and silent, yet within them, the motion swirled, like autumn leaves caught in a restless wind. Charles IX wandered through shadowed halls, step-heavy, each breath weighed by memories of faces that could not be forgotten. Henry watched his brother and his mother absorbing lessons in fear, in patience, and in the subtle power that guided decisions. Even in the quietest moments, Catherine observed both sons, her mind attuned to the tremors of doubt and the stirrings of anxiety, measuring carefully how trauma could mold strength or fracture resolve. Sleep was restless, even for those who lay in the softest beds. Dreams mingled with whispers of mistrust, loss, and necessity. And yet, these nights shaped the monarchy, tempered the airs, and forged caution into vigilance. The courtiers noticed the change, the subtle shift in demeanor, the hesitations, and the quiet glances, as if every shadow held a lesson, every silence contained guidance. In the quiet of chambers, Catherine's presence was both anchor and compass, her voice a soft reminder that every decision carries weight, that leadership is forged through both wisdom and the careful application of fear. Through this strain, the royal family learned patience, resilience, and the delicate art of balancing authority with insight, of shaping perception without losing control. Even as the sun rose and light filled corridors, the echoes of psychological tension remained, softly reminding that the crown is as heavy on the mind as it is on the head, and that guidance and subtle control can shape the fate of a kingdom. In the hushed corners of the palace, where candlelight flickered softly, Catherine de Medici gathered her trusted few, advisors whose loyalty was proven and whose minds mirrored hers. Keen, observant, subtle. These rooms were more than chambers. They were sanctuaries of strategy, where the currents of power were measured carefully, and every word weighed as if it were gold. Each advisor brought insight, some of history, some of diplomacy, some of human nature itself. And Catherine listened with patience, allowing every thought to ripple gently through her own careful calculations. They spoke softly of alliance, of distant courts, of rumors and whispers, each detail a thread to weave into her grand design, to anticipate danger, and to guide opportunity. Her sons were present, learning quietly how guidance could be invisible, yet absolute, how decisions made behind closed doors could shape the destiny of an entire kingdom. Catherine's mind moved like water, adapting, flowing, shaping, absorbing knowledge, and redirecting it with subtle precision, so that even the slightest change could influence the vast machinery of France itself. Her advisors acted as extensions of her will, moving carefully in the corridors, communicating with courtiers, observing the reactions of nobles, and reporting every nuance that might affect loyalty or reveal opportunity. Through these secret councils, Catherine maintained control, not by force alone, but by the quiet orchestration of intelligence, foresight, and the careful application of human understanding. Even as night deepened and shadows lengthened, the palace remained alive, with quiet thought and invisible influence, a testament to the subtle power that guided every decision and ensured that Catherine's vision remained unbroken. In this secret council, every whisper mattered, every observation was a lesson, and every plan was a step toward sustaining the delicate balance of fear, respect, and enduring authority. In the quiet shadows of the palace, Catherine de Medici conceived a network, not of swords, not of armies, but of subtle influence. The group of women whose beauty and cunning were instruments of power. They were called the Flying Squadron, a collection of courtiers and confidants, whose purpose was delicate, yet decisive, to seduce, to observe, to persuade, and, when necessary, to eliminate threats. Catherine understood the human heart, its desires, its vanities, its weaknesses, and she used these truths, like threads in a tapestry, guiding the moves of her operatives. With quiet precision, these women moved through the court, their smiles gentle, their whispers like silk, their presence disarming, yet carrying the weight of deadly purpose. Courtiers and foreign dignitaries found themselves drawn into calculated encounters, unaware that the very charm they admired was a carefully placed strategy, woven by the Queen Mother, through observation, through secret messages, through the delicate application of influence. Catherine extended her reach beyond what any king's army or noble allegiance could accomplish. The flying squadron served not merely as spies, but as living instruments, shaping loyalty, sowing subtle fear, and, when necessary, enforcing quiet consequences that reminded all that Catherine's presence was inescapable, even in the softest shadows of the court. And as candles flickered and the night deepened, Catherine's hand guided every movement, every smile, every whispered word, ensuring that influence flowed through channels unseen, felt by all who held ambition or dared to oppose her. The flying squadron was more than power. It was artistry, a quiet orchestration, a psychology, and human desire, woven carefully to maintain control and to safeguard the throne through the subtle yet absolute force of strategy and foresight. Night fell softly over Paris, yet beneath the calm, a storm had gathered, unseen but inevitable. The streets, usually filled with laughter and candlelight, were quiet, as if the city itself held its breath, awaiting the moment when whispers would turn into cries and shadows would claim the night. Huguenot leaders believed in the fragile promise of peace, their steps guided by trust, their hearts unaware of the currents flowing around them, shaped by strategy and the careful orchestration of Catherine's mind. Signal was given, soft, almost imperceptible, yet enough to release the wave that had been planned, every element in place, every movement calculated. The first flickers of fear rose as houses were visited, messages delivered, and the weight of authority pressed gently, yet unrelentingly, upon those who had once believed in safety. Paris awoke to a night of trembling, its cobblestones slick with anticipation, and the quiet realization that the fragile bonds of loyalty and life could be undone by a single orchestrated hand. Catherine, in her chambers, observed the unfolding events, her mind attuned to every whisper, every reaction, every heartbeat. That marked the beginning of a transformation that would echo through history. Even as the first tremors spread through the city, there was an eerie serenity in her control, a sense that the night was hers to shape, that every outcome was foreseen, every consequence anticipated. And so, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre began, not with chaos, but with a quiet precision, a subtle unfolding, like shadows stretching over the city, marking the night with fear, strategy, and unyielding influence. The night deepened, and Paris held its breath. Chilly, each quiet courtyard echoed with uncertainty, as if the city itself sensed the fragility of life. In these hours of shadows, whispers traveled from window to window, from door to door, carrying both rumor and dread, as families huddled behind shutters, listening to the soft, ominous murmurs that foretold a night none would soon forget. The streets were empty, save for the soft footfalls of those who moved with purpose, their eyes wide with anticipation, hearts beating quietly, in rhythm with the tension of the city. Merchants paused, their stalls abandoned, as fear crept into even the most ordinary corners, and the river Seine seemed to mirror the unease, its waters flowing slowly, as if mourning the fragile peace that had been shattered. Courtiers and nobles felt the weight of silence, their minds turning, calculating, wondering who would act and who would fall. As the currents of terror swept softly through the city, Catherine watched, her eyes steady, her mind absorbing every tremor of fear, every cautious glance, measuring the reach of influence and the subtle unfolding of control. The night stretched endlessly, a tapestry of anticipation, woven with shadows and whispers, and Paris became a stage where fear was not chaotic, but directed, precise, and almost poetic in its inevitability. Through quiet corridors and hidden alcoves, the city learned that power could move silently, that authority could command without a sword, and that the hand guiding events was unseen, yet undeniably present, even as dawn approached, casting soft light over rooftops. The echo of the night lingered in hearts, a gentle, persistent reminder. The fear, once seated, could take root and shape the destiny of a kingdom. Within the silent chambers of the palace, Charles IX wondered, each step measured, each breath weighed by the weight of expectation and the shadow of decision. He had been guided, persuaded, and sometimes gently pressured by the quiet influence of his mother, Catherine, whose calm presence, mastermind, sharp, calculating, and unyielding. The young king's heart was heavy with confusion, torn between duty and conscience, each thought a ripple across the still waters of his mind. And yet he moved forward, aware that hesitation could unravel not only orders, but the delicate control of the court. Advisors whispered, their words soft, their intentions layered, guiding the king's hand toward actions that would change the city and the kingdom forever. Charles Ix's eyes saw the faces of those he would command, and the fear within him was tempered by trust in his mother and the belief that her counsel was a shield and a sword. In equal measure, each decree, each subtle signal was weighed heavily, for he knew the lives affected, the families torn, and the city trembling. Yet Catherine's quiet guidance steered him through the storm like a steady hand over a churning sea. In the quiet of night, as Paris lay tense, the king carried his burden, his mind stretched between innocence and obligation, and the soft realization the power was rarely pure and never simple. Catherine's orchestration was evident in every hesitation, every glance, every whispered decision for the king and the kingdom were instruments in her delicate symphony of control. And so Charles IX played his part, not out of malice, but under guidance and the weight of circumstances, shaped by fear, strategy, and the quiet, enduring influence of a mother who had mastered the art of unseen power. In the quiet halls of power, Catherine observed the delicate dance between faith and ambition. Catholics and Protestants alike were pieces on her intricate board, their fervor, their devotion, both a tool and a challenge. She understood the subtle currents that ran beneath sermons, beneath prayer, beneath the very rituals that shaped hearts and swayed minds. Religion was not merely belief, but a lever of influence, a channel through which power flowed silently. Courts and chapels alike felt her presence, even when unseen. Each decision she guided, each favor or reprimand, shaping the balance between obedience and rebellion. Catherine's wisdom lay in the quiet manipulation of perception, ensuring that neither faction grew strong enough to threaten her authority, yet aware enough to serve her purpose, maintaining a delicate equilibrium in a kingdom teetering on the edge of conflict. Through ceremonies, through alliances, through whispered counsel, she wove threads of loyalty and fear through both Catholic and Protestant circles. Her influence subtle, but unyielding, like roots of an ancient tree, holding the ground while shaping the branches above. Even as preachers spoke, and sermons echoed, the soft touch of strategy was present, guiding hearts and directing outcomes toward a vision known fully only to Catherine. Through religion, she maintained control, not by brute force, but through understanding, through observation, through the quiet orchestration of devotion, influence, and perception. Each step calculated, each ripple measured, and as the night deepened, the city slept, oblivious to the gentle, persistent shaping of faith and fear by a queen whose vision extended beyond sight, and whose strategy was as quiet as it was absolute. The palace was quiet, yet beneath the stillness, emotions churned like hidden rivers. Charles IX walked slowly through corridors, his mind heavy, his heart shadowed by the weight of what had occurred. He saw faces, remembered names, and the ghosts of decisions haunted him, even as the courtiers moved lightly through gilded halls, their voices polite, but their eyes reflecting the tremor of fear and uncertainty. Catherine observed her son's quiet struggle, measuring the depth of their hesitation, their growing awareness that power carries a cost, that authority can wound as deeply as it can command. Henry felt the tension, learning the lessons that Catherine's mind had long known, that influence and manipulation could shape events far beyond immediate perception, and that survival required patience, foresight, and sometimes moral compromise. Sleep came fitfully for the royal family, each night punctuated by whispered anxieties, by shadows of remembrance that refused to be silenced. The young king's thoughts turned over possibilities, his conscience questioning, his mother guiding quietly, ensuring that reflection morphed into caution and fear into vigilance. The palace itself seemed to absorb these burdens, its walls echoing with unspoken truths, its corridors holding the weight of memory, grief, and strategy. And yet, through all this, Catherine's calm hand kept the family tethered to purpose, to survival, to the delicate art of power and guidance. In these moments, the royal family learned that leadership is never simple, that choices ripple endlessly, and that even the strongest can carry the heaviest of unseen burdens. And so, the echoes of the massacre persisted, softly insistently, reminding all that history is shaped not just by actions, but by their consequences, woven gently into hearts, minds, and the memory of a kingdom. The grand halls, once alive with laughter and debate, now carried a soft tension as the nobility processed. The tremors of the night, whispers filled shadowed corridors, words carefully chosen, alliance considered, friendship measured, and fear, soft, persistent, threaded through every conversation. Some nobles bowed quietly, accepting the subtle shifts in power, their faces polite, yet their minds racing with calculation and self-preservation. Watched and waited, seeking opportunity, measuring loyalty and betrayal, noticing the small gestures that revealed intentions hidden beneath courtesy and civility. Catherine's influence was felt even from afar. In her absence, her network, her careful orchestration, softly directing the currents of fear and obedience through subtle, invisible threads. Letters were exchanged, carried in silence, words hinting at compliance or veiled warnings, and the nobility learned that every choice was under scrutiny. Every action could ripple through the fragile web of power. The young king observed, learning through quiet example, how authority could bend hearts, shape decisions, and maintain control without ever raising a hand. Through presence, influence, and quiet, persistent guidance, the city beyond the palace felt the same tension, its streets alive with soft murmurings, fear moving like water through homes, markets, and gardens, touching all who lived under the shadow of the monarchy. Through all this, the nobility's reactions shaped the next days, every alliance tested, every loyalty weighed, as Catherine's strategy continued quietly to guide the fate of France. And so, Paris remained a city under gentle, invisible currents, where fear, observation, and ambition, and the subtle shifts of power, were as delicate as the morning mist over the Seine, beyond the immediate stir, beyond whispers in shadowed halls. Catherine's mind moved like a slow river, deep, deliberate, carrying currents unseen toward distant shores. Every alliance, every marriage, every whispered promise, and every quiet act of persuasion was measured before sight, as if she were arranging the pieces of a vast, intricate chessboard. She knew that power was never static, and that kingdoms, like gardens, needed tended, planted, and careful, patient cultivation. Courtiers, nobles, and foreign emissaries were all threads in her tapestry, and she guided their movements with subtlety, soft influence, and quiet understanding of human desire, fear, and ambition. Her sons were instruments and pupils, learning not only duty, but the art of perception, the patience, and the quiet orchestration of influence. Through long nights and whispered counsel, Catherine considered not only today, but the years to come, the shifting alliances, the tides of faith and ambition, the fragile balance of loyalty and fear. Even the smallest gesture, a favor given, a message sent, could ripple across France, changing minds, shaping destinies, and reinforcing her subtle, yet unyielding, control over the kingdom. In her chambers, illuminated by soft candlelight, she moved with calm precision, like a conductor of a vast symphony, where each note, each silence, was deliberate, carefully calculated, guiding the music of power through corridors, hearts, and minds. And so, Catherine's strategy stretched beyond fear, beyond immediate survival, into a vision where control was maintained through patience, wisdom, and the quiet orchestration of influence, ever flowing like a river beneath the moonlight. The city breathed uneasily as whispers of faith and fear moved like mist through narrow streets and shadowed squares. Catholics prayed quietly, their hearts steadfast, their voices soft, yet carrying an unspoken tension, aware that every glance and every murmur might carry consequence. Protestants gathered, their faith burning, their minds alert, for even in the sanctity of prayer, they felt the weight of watchful eyes and the invisible threads that wove authority and fear through their lives. Catherine watched, calmly thoughtful, observing how devotion could be both shield and weapon, how belief could inspire loyalty and yet sow caution in equal measure. She understood the delicate balance, how passion could tip toward rebellion or bend toward obedience, how every sermon, every gathering was part of a living, breathing landscape that required careful tending. The nobility sensed it too, measuring allegiances, calculating influence, their eyes and ears attuned to the subtle shifts of faith and fear that spread softly like ripples across a quiet pond. Through whispered counsel, through careful observation, Catherine ensured that no faction grew so strong as to threaten her careful orchestration. Yet each remained vibrant enough to remind all that power is fragile and authority must be nurtured. Even as the city slept, beneath the soft glow of moonlight, the tension lingered in hearts, in minds, and in the quiet spaces where the influence of a mother, king, and strategist moved gently like a tide unseen, yet impossible to ignore. And so, the religious landscape of France was shaped quietly by observation, foresight, and the subtle orchestration of one who understood that the currents of belief could be guided as carefully as the rivers of power themselves. The young king wandered through corridors dimly lit, each shadow stretching long, like the weight upon his mind Every whisper, every glance, seemed magnified, his thoughts turning inward, as if the walls themselves carried secrets, and eyes unseen watched every movement. Charles IX's heart felt the pulse of fear, an invisible tension that grew heavier with each passing day, the echoes of the massacre haunting his conscience. Even amidst courtiers, he felt alone, for the loyalty he sought was often veiled in politeness, and every smile, every courteous bow was measured against unspoken intentions. Catherine's influence was constant, her counsel a guiding hand, yet each decision he made felt like a test, a step along a narrow path where one misstep might collapse the delicate order. His dreams were restless, filled with faces, and the soft murmurs of what could have been prevented and what could not. His sleep broken by the persistent hum of responsibility and fear, and yet through isolation and paranoia, to the subtle art of observation, the caution, the patience, each fear, bless, each doubt, toward understanding the delicate machinery of power, the palace became both sanctuary and trap, its corridors echoing with the soft rhythm of his heartbeat and the quiet realization that to govern was to carry not only authority, but the relentless burden of conscience, consequence, and control. In these quiet, meditative hours, Charles IX discovered that power could isolate, that fear could shape perception, and that the mind must navigate both shadows and light to endure, and to survive. The palace breathed quietly, even as the city trembled beyond its walls. Courtiers moved with practiced grace, footsteps off, their eyes alert, balancing loyalty, ambition, and survival in a world unsettled. Laughter and conversation echoed lightly through the halls, masking the tension beneath, like delicate lace over hardened steel. Each gesture, each bow, each carefully measured word, a signal of subtle strength. Catherine observed, her gaze steady, her mind mapping the currents that ran through her court, understanding that even in chaos, resilience could be nurtured through discipline, observation, and the careful orchestration of alliances. Nobles and advisors adapted to uncertainty, learning to navigate shadows, to measure their ambitions, to balance self-interest with duty, and to recognize the quiet power of patience and foresight. Even the smallest courtiers moved as part of a living, breathing organism, their actions echoing through the intricate hierarchy. Each smile, each whisper, a response to the invisible hand, guiding the rhythm of the court through gardens and chambers. In the quiet glow of candlelight, strategy intertwined with survival, and the court endured, not merely through power, but through adaptability, observation, and the subtle understanding that life in the palace required vigilance, even in the softest of moments. The young king watched, learning the lessons of endurance, how loyalty and fear could coexist, and how the heart of governance was often shaped by quiet resilience and the art of navigating uncertainty. In this way, the royal court continued, its presence a calm amid turmoil, a reminder that strength is often quiet, patient, and persistent, flowing like a river beneath still waters. Beyond the shadows of Paris, and beyond the weight of turmoil, a young prince prepared quietly, Henry of Navarre, his mind alert, his heart steady, even as the world around him swirled with unrest. He moved with thoughtfulness, measuring alliances, understanding the fragility of loyalty, and the subtle rhythms of power, knowing that strength was not only in force, but in patience, perception, and the quiet cultivation of trust. Henry observed the fractures within France, the rifts between belief and ambition, and he understood that the seeds of peace must be planted carefully, nourished slowly, before they could grow into stability. Courts and cities alike would not yield easily, yet he learned to navigate the currents of fear and hope, measuring his words, his gestures, and the silent power of restraint. Even as massacres echoed in memory, he kept his resolve, understanding that healing requires both courage and the soft touch of diplomacy, that the future could be shaped by understanding rather than domination. Catherine watched, her strategies unfolding, yet even she could sense that Henry's approach held a quiet strength different from her own, one that did not rely solely on fear, but on the subtle art of inclusion and foresight. And so, in the soft light of possibility, amidst chaos and reflection, the seeds of future peace were sown by a young man whose vision extended beyond the immediate storm toward a France that could endure and heal. Over time, years passed quietly, and yet the echoes of Catherine's choices lingered in every corner of France, like soft shadows stretching over streets, villages, and palaces. Families remembered the tremor of fear, the nights of uncertainty, the delicate balance between survival and the relentless pull of ambition, etched into their hearts like an unseen mark. Courts moved cautiously, their steps measured, allies weighed carefully, and enemies observed silently. For every action was now shadowed by memory, and every word carried the resonance of consequence. Catherine herself observed the unfolding effects, her mind cataloging the long-term ripples of her choices, understanding that power, even in its softest exercise. The young kings, Charles IX, Henry III, carried the burdens of conscience, their hearts marked by the past, their minds tempered by lessons of caution, fear, and the delicate weight of authority. Even as France moved forward, the nation remained entwined with threads of memory woven through generations, reminders that leadership and ambition can echo long after the immediate moment. The rivers flowed gently over stones worn smooth by time, and the cities, though alive with movement, still held the quiet hum of history shaped by the careful, persistent orchestration of one whose influence reached far beyond her own years. In this meditative silence, France learned that the shadows of a ruler's decisions can linger like the soft touch of twilight, ever present, guiding, shaping, and reminding all who live under the sweep of history, beyond the shadowed corridors of fear, beyond the weight of past decisions. Henry of Navarre moved steadily, his mind clear, his heart resolute. Where Catherine's world had been shaped by strategy, fear, and quiet manipulation, Henry's path unfolded gently, guided by pragmatism, by understanding, and by the quiet power of compromise. He navigated the fractures of faith, welcoming dialogue where others sought domination, offering peace where others sowed division. His approach slow, deliberate, like sunlight filtering softly through the leaves of a heavy forest. Courts and cities alike felt the difference as alliances formed naturally, loyalty born not of fear, but of respect and understanding, healing the scars left by years of unrest. Even the young kings, Charles IX and Henry III, could witness from afar the power of patience, foresight, and inclusion. As France slowly began to breathe again, its wounds softened by a steady, nurturing hand. The streets, once tense with whispers of terror, now carried murmurs of hope. Markets thrived once more, and rivers reflected the calm of a kingdom, finding its balance after long nights of shadow and turmoil. Henry's rise was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly transformative, showing that strength is not always in fear, that authority need not be enforced, but earned through understanding, justice, and care. And so, as the kingdom turned toward the future, the lessons of the past remained, soft echoes in the hearts of those who governed, reminding all that peace is a patient, deliberate creation, grown slowly, gently, like a tree from seed to shade. The palace stands in memory, its walls silent witnesses, to the years shaped by a queen, whose mind moved like a river, deep, deliberate, and endlessly flowing. Catherine's hand guided the course of France, through shadows of fear, through storms of ambition, and the quiet murmur of faith, her influence lasting beyond her own days, softly etched into the rhythm of the kingdom. Her sons, her family, and her people carried the echoes of her choices, lessons written in the weight of memory, reminders that power is both fragile and profound, and that leadership shapes not only events, but hearts, minds, and generations. And yet, for every shadow she cast, there rose light in the form of leaders like Henry of Navarre, whose patient, inclusive hand restored balance, healed divisions, and nurtured peace from the seeds sown by turmoil. Catherine's story is a quiet reminder that intelligence and ambition alone cannot ensure harmony, that the pursuit of power without moral guidance can fracture a nation, even as it elevates a ruler. And in the gentle hush of history, her legacy endures, soft, meditative, and reflective, a lesson whispered to all who seek authority, that the heart of leadership lies not in fear, but in wisdom, restraint, and the quiet courage to shape a just path. The night deepens, and the city sleeps, while the river of time flows steadily, carrying stories of ambition, of fear, of hope, and of lessons written in the lives of those who came before and after. And so, we rest with these reflections, allowing the soft, gentle currents of history, memory, and understanding to lull the mind, to ease the heart, and to drift slowly into the quiet embrace of sleep. As we close this journey through the quiet corridors of history, through the shadows and light of a queen's ambition, and breathe deeply, let the soft echoes of Catherine de Medici's story linger gently, like a whisper carried on the night air, reminding us that every choice, every action, shapes not only our world, but the hearts of those around us. Take a moment to feel the lessons woven in history, the delicate dance of power, of fear and hope, and the quiet strength of patience, wisdom, and understanding. If you found peace or reflection in this journey through time, consider liking this video or leaving a gentle comment, sharing what touched your heart most. And now, allow yourself to drift into the calm embrace of sleep, while the stories of the past flow softly through your mind like a river beneath the moonlight, carrying whispers of lessons, reflections, and quiet understanding. Rest now, and let the gentle currents of history and the soft touch of reflection guide you into a peaceful night and a restful sleep.